What's going on, YouTube? It's your boy Lonnie Reacts, and today we back with another historical video. Now, this video is titled Five Ancient Civilizations More Terrifying Than Your Nightmare. Now, off rip, I already know the Assyrians are gonna be on this list because the Assyrians were something insane. The shit they were doing was actually insane. But I'm curious as to what the other civilizations would be. So as usual, I don't have too much to say. Let's just jump into this video.
Think the Saw movies were gruesome? The Mesopotamians would laugh. Their justice system handed out punishments that made medieval torture look quaint. And if you thought gladiators were the height of brutal entertainment, wait till you hear about the Aztecs' version of game night.
Okay, I
The
figured the
Aztecs,
Aztecs
a
would be on
society
here.
built on blood. The Aztecs didn't just practice human sacrifice. They ran it like an industry. It wasn't a rare ritual. It was a daily event. If you lived in Tenochtitlan, you either watched sacrifices or became one. The empire believed the gods needed fresh human hearts to keep the sun rising. No sacrifices, no sunlight. Simple as that. The numbers are staggering. When Templo Mayor was rededicated in 1487, records claim 80,000 people were sacrificed in just 4 days. Some historians say this was an exaggeration, but even conservative estimates put the annual death toll at 20,000.
That's insane.
That's an assembly line level of killing. The victims weren't buried quietly either. Their skulls were put on Tsompantli, massive racks displaying thousands of heads. The biggest one held over 100,000
Literally
skulls, a reminder of what happened to enemies of the empire. Most sacrifices came from war. The Aztecs didn't fight to kill on the battlefield. They fought to capture. Prisoners weren't just trophies. They were currency for the gods. The more captives a warrior brought back, the higher their status. A soldier who killed in battle was seen as careless. A soldier who captured dozens alive, that was a hero. Sacrifices were not quick or painless. Victims were marched up steep temple steps where 4 priests held them down on a
Literally
stone
Skypea.
slab. The executioner, using a razor-sharp obsidian knife, sliced open the chest and tore out the still beating heart. The heart was lifted to the sky while the body was thrown down the temple steps. But the ritual didn't end there. Some bodies were skinned and their flesh was worn by priests.
Oh my
Others
God.
were dismembered, their bones used as relics. Not all sacrifices were warriors. Children were prime offerings, especially to Tlaloc, the rain god. The Aztecs believed children's
Literally
tears brought
Skypea.
rain, so priests ensured they cried before death. Some were drowned, others were burned alive. If a child had physical deformities, they were considered even more sacred and were more likely to be sacrificed. Some victims didn't go to waste, at least not by Aztec standards. There was cannibalism. The elite feasted on the arms and thighs of sacrificed warriors. It wasn't for survival, it was a ceremonial meal. Eating the
God.
flesh of a fallen enemy was believed to transfer their power, but only the high-ranking elite got to eat. If you were a commoner, you had to settle for maize. The sacrifices weren't just about religion, they were political control. The Aztecs ruled over dozens of subject states, and these regions were forced to send people for sacrifice. Imagine being ruled by an empire that demanded your family members as a blood tax. No surprise that many of these states hated the Aztecs. So when Hernán Cortés and his Spanish forces arrived in 1519, they didn't have to fight the Aztecs alone. The people the empire had terrorized for years were more than happy to help take them down. Cortés formed alliances with these states, using their knowledge and manpower to launch an assault on the Aztec capital. By 1521, after brutal battles and a devastating smallpox epidemic, Tenochtitlan fell. When the Spanish stormed the city, they were horrified by what they found. Towering skull racks, blood-stained temples,
This
and
is
human
insane.
sacrifices still happening as the city burned. Cortés and his men may not have been saints, but even they put an end to the Aztecs' ritual slaughter. And just like that, an empire built on blood collapsed in a sea of fire, disease, and betrayal. The gods didn't save them. Maybe they were full. The Spartans, a nightmare of social engineering.
Now
The
this
moment the
interesting.
Spartan baby took its first breath,
because
it was judged.
they actually
If the
were
child was weak,
very
sickly,
brutal.
or had any kind of deformity, it was abandoned in the wilderness or tossed off a
Yep.
cliff at Mount Taygetus. No exceptions. Sparta didn't waste resources on the unfit. Only the strongest survived, and even they weren't safe for long. Sparta wasn't a city of art, culture, or philosophy. It was a military factory. Every male citizen existed for one purpose: war. From the age of 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families
Pretty sure there
and
was
thrown
some
into the
farmers,
Agage,
too.
a state-run training
Or the
program
warriors
that made
were
modern boot
farmers.
camps look like daycare. Their education, learning how to fight, steal, and endure pain without complaint. Literacy was an afterthought. Spartan boys weren't trained to be thinkers. They were trained to be killers. Starvation was part of the program. Boys were encouraged to steal food, but
And if you
beaten
got
mercilessly if they were caught.
Mhm.
Not because they stole, but
'Cause you
because they
got caught.
failed to do it properly. They were also routinely whipped, sometimes to death, in public endurance trials. The message was clear. Pain was a lesson, and weakness was a death sentence. The violence wasn't just training, it was entertainment. Spartan boys were forced to fight each other, often to the brink of death. The weak were culled early, and only the strongest made it to adulthood. By the time a Spartan reached 20, he was a full-fledged soldier, expected to fight until either victory or death. Even then, he wasn't free. Spartans lived in military barracks until age 30, only seeing their families in secret. Marriage was allowed, but husbands often had to sneak out at night just to be with their wives. Love wasn't a priority, producing the next generation of warriors was.
That's what
Then there were
Sparta
the
failed.
Helots, the enslaved underclass who made up the majority of Sparta's population. Sparta had no economy, no industry, and no trade. Instead, Helots did all the farming, labor, and domestic work. The catch? They were treated like livestock. The Spartan government saw them as a permanent threat
Another reason
because,
why they failed.
logically, if your slaves outnumber you 10 to 1, they're probably not thrilled about it. So how did Sparta maintain control? Terror. Every year, the Spartans declared ritual war on the Helots. Young Spartan warriors, called Crypteia, were sent out into the countryside to assassinate Helots at random. No weapons, no armor, just a dagger and the element of surprise. This wasn't a rebellion crackdown. The Helots didn't have to do anything wrong. Killing them was simply a rite of passage for young warriors. The goal was to keep them afraid, hopeless, and too terrified to rise up. Sparta was the only Greek city-state where murder was state-sanctioned genocide. Spartan women lived under a different but equally extreme set of rules. Compared to other Greek women, they had more rights, but that's only because they were expected to breed soldiers. They were trained from childhood to be physically strong, racing, wrestling, and exercising to ensure they could produce healthy sons. If a woman couldn't bear children, she was considered useless. Spartan wives were even expected to share their husbands if another woman needed a child. Love? Personal choice? Not important. The only thing that mattered was making more Spartans. Despite their terrifying reputation, Spartans weren't invincible. Their rigid system made them terrible at adapting. They refused to embrace change, trade, or diplomacy. That
Stupid.
worked until they met an enemy they couldn't overpower. In 371 BCE, the Spartans suffered a crushing defeat at the Battle of Leuctra against Thebes. This was the first time their unbeatable army was exposed as just
The
another
Sacred Band of
military
Thebes.
force. The
I remember
Thebans
learning
used
about that.
innovative tactics, flanking and outmaneuvering the rigid Spartan formations. The result? Sparta's army was shattered, and their myth of invincibility died on the battlefield. The fall of Sparta wasn't sudden. It was a slow, painful collapse. Over the next century, they lost influence, territory, and soldiers. Unlike Athens, which rebuilt itself after defeat, Sparta had nothing to fall back on. No economy, no culture, no innovation, just war. And when they could no longer dominate their enemies, they became irrelevant. By the time Rome took over Greece, Sparta was a living museum, a once feared empire reduced to a novelty for foreign tourists. The Spartans thought they were building the ultimate warrior society. What they actually built was a ticking time bomb. The same system that made them strong also made them fragile, and when it finally collapsed, no one rushed to save them. Mesopotamia, justice in the age of cruelty. If you ever find yourself complaining about modern laws, just be glad you weren't living in ancient Mesopotamia. This was a society where breaking a rule didn't just get you fined, it got you mutilated, drowned, or executed on the spot. Justice wasn't
I know
about
that.
rehabilitation. It was about making an example out of people in the most brutal way possible. And if you thought punishments were reserved for serious crimes, think again. In Mesopotamia, simply building a faulty house could cost you your life.
What?
The most infamous legal system of the time was Hammurabi's Code, written in 1755 BCE. This wasn't just a set of laws, it was a blueprint for state-sponsored violence. With over 280 laws, it covered everything from property disputes to murder, and its signature punishment was an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, literally. If you broke someone's arm, the government would break yours. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's son was executed. Justice wasn't about fairness, it was about revenge, served cold, public, and with extreme prejudice. Then there were the punishments reserved for the lower classes. Wealthy nobles could sometimes pay a fine and walk away, but if you were poor, your options were limited to death, dismemberment, or slavery. They were at the very bottom, treated as property. If they talked back, they could have their ears cut off. If they tried to escape, their master could gouge out their eyes. And if a woman was accused of adultery, straight to the Euphrates River for a trial by drowning. If she survived, she was innocent. If she drowned, well, case closed. Criminals weren't the only ones who suffered. Doctors had their own high-risk profession, and malpractice wasn't taken lightly. If a surgeon botched an operation on a noble and the patient died, the surgeon's hands were cut off.
Oh my
There were
God.
no second chances. If you were a Mesopotamian doctor, you either got it right the first time or you never worked again. Literally. And don't think priests had it easy either. Mesopotamians took their gods seriously. If a priest misinterpreted an omen or a fortune teller made a bad prediction, they could be beaten, exiled, or killed for misleading the people. Religion and law were deeply connected, and disobeying the gods was seen as worse than disobeying the king. Execution methods were creative and public. Hanging, impalement, burning alive. Mesopotamians didn't just kill criminals, they made a show out of it. Some criminals were skinned alive, while others were buried in the walls of buildings as human sacrifices to ensure a structure's strength. If you were really unlucky, you might be sentenced to the pit of lions, where death wasn't instant, but a slow, bloody spectacle. But here's the irony. For all their brutality, Mesopotamians were also pioneers of civilization.
They were.
They gave the world writing, irrigation, and organized government. But they also made sure breaking the rules meant you suffered in ways that would make medieval torture look mild. Their laws kept order, but they did it through fear. Over time, newer civilizations phased out Mesopotamian justice. The Persians, the Greeks, and later the Romans introduced less extreme, but still brutal, legal systems. But Hammurabi's code remained one of the most influential legal documents in history. Even today, the concept of an eye for an eye still lingers, just without the part where people get their actual eyes ripped out. Mesopotamians built the foundation of modern society, but they also proved that civilization and state-sanctioned cruelty can go hand in hand. And for thousands of years, nobody really questioned it. Ancient Egypt, the dark side of
Egypt.
divine perfection.
Mm.
Ancient Egypt is remembered for
Let's learn
pyramids,
something.
golden tombs, and powerful pharaohs. But what's usually left out? The fact that Egyptian elites were obsessed with the human body, and not in
They
a way
were.
that makes anyone comfortable.
I know that.
They weren't just building monuments to honor the dead. They were cutting people open, experimenting on corpses, and possibly even manipulating genetics in ways that would raise a few eyebrows today. Egyptians believed the body was sacred, but to them, sacred didn't mean untouchable. It meant worth modifying, preserving, and sometimes outright dissecting. Their priests and embalmers were early surgeons, performing medical
Bro, you know
procedures
something?
that
I remember reading a little something about what Egyptian pharaohs would do. Bro, they would go out like early morning into the Nile when the farmers were farming and people were in the market shopping. And they would go along the banks of the Nile and they would literally ejaculate into the Nile. And like the people watching, they would sometimes try to drink it, bro. That is so insane to me. That's just insane.
would have been considered nightmares anywhere else. They conducted brain removal through the nose, internal organ extraction, and experimental surgeries, some of which appear to have been tested on the living first. Egyptian medical texts describe procedures that sound more like a horror script than early science. Doctors performed primitive brain surgery, drilling holes into skulls to relieve pressure, though the survival rate was questionable. Some treatments involved burning wounds with fire, pouring hot resin into cuts, or applying mixtures of crocodile dung and honey to injuries. The idea was that the gods guided medicine, and apparently, the gods had a twisted sense of humor. But it wasn't just medicine, it was experimentation. Evidence suggests that prisoners, slaves, and the poor were used as medical test subjects. These weren't quick or painless procedures. Victims were often cut open while still alive, so priests could observe the effects of disease in real time. If a person had a mystery illness, their body became a science experiment. No consent, no anesthesia, just brutal curiosity. Then there's the royal gene pool, which was more of a genetic disaster than a divine bloodline. Pharaohs married their own sisters, daughters, and nieces, all to keep their lineage pure. The result? Generations of rulers with severe birth defects, mental impairments, and genetic disorders. King Tutankhamun was a medical wreck. He had a clubfoot, malformed bones, and a severe overbite, all thanks to his parents being siblings. His family wasn't unique. Many pharaohs suffered from diseases caused by inbreeding, but the idea of marrying outside the royal family was unthinkable. And then there's mummification, the real horror show. Egyptians believed that preserving the body was essential for the afterlife, which meant removing anything they deemed unnecessary, like the brain. The process involved stabbing a hooked instrument through the nose, scrambling the brain into mush, and then yanking it out in pieces. The heart, however, was left intact, because Egyptians believed it was the center of intelligence. Let's be honest, not their best scientific guess. Organs were carefully removed, dried, and stored in canopic jars, while the rest of the body was soaked in natron salt for 40 days to remove moisture. The elite were lavishly preserved, while the lower classes, not so much. Many commoners were buried in mass graves, left to rot in the desert. But even elite mummies weren't safe. If you thought being buried in a gold-covered tomb protected you, think again.
Grave robbers.
Tomb raiding wasn't just a crime, it was an economy. Many mummies were looted, burned, or even ground into powder and sold as medicine. Yes,
Yeah.
Europeans in the
Europeans
Middle
ate
Ages
this shit.
believed crushed mummy remains could cure
Disgusting.
disease. Thousands of Egyptian mummies were turned into miracle powders and consumed, because apparently there's no limit to bad medical advice. And then there's the accidental mummies, not the kind prepared for the afterlife, but the ones preserved by pure chance. Egyptian tombs created the perfect dry, airtight conditions, which meant that some people who weren't even meant to be mummified ended up naturally preserved for centuries. Archaeologists have found bodies that still have hair, skin, and even tattoos, as if they just fell asleep 3,000 years ago. The Egyptian obsession with the afterlife went beyond mummies.
Book of the
Some
Dead.
pharaohs were buried with their servants, because why not bring your workforce to the afterlife?
That was pretty normal.
While other
though.
cultures practiced human sacrifice, Egyptians had their own spin. Kill a few people so they can serve the king forever. High-ranking officials, servants, and even animals were strangled or
Yup.
buried alive, all so their ruler wouldn't have to lift a finger in the next world. Egyptians were obsessed with preserving bodies for eternity, but the reality? Most of those bodies ended up stolen, destroyed, or eaten. For a civilization fixated on immortality, they sure did a lot of horrifying things to the living. The Incas, death as a sacred
The
duty.
Incas.
The Inca Empire
don't know
wasn't
too much
just a
about the
society.
Incas.
It was a well-oiled machine fueled by devotion, sacrifice, and a whole lot of terror. While they're often remembered for engineering marvels and vast cities, one thing history books don't emphasize enough is how they kept their gods happy. The Incas didn't just accept death, they embraced it. And if you were chosen for sacrifice, there was no escape. Unlike other civilizations that sacrificed prisoners of war, the Incas preferred their victims to be perfect, the best offerings, children. They believed kids were the purest
Oh my God.
beings, making them the ultimate tribute to the gods. This wasn't a last-minute execution. These children were selected months, sometimes years in advance, fed the best foods, and treated like royalty. But they weren't being rewarded. They were being prepared to die. The most infamous ritual was Capacocha, a state-run sacrifice system designed to ensure the empire's relationship with the gods stayed strong. When an emperor died, when a natural disaster struck, or when a new ruler needed divine approval, the Incas turned to children. These kids, often between 6 and 15 years old, were taken from their families and sent on a grueling march through the Andes. Some walked hundreds of miles to reach their final resting place, dressed in elaborate clothes and adorned with jewelry, because even in death, appearances mattered. Execution methods varied. Some were drugged with coca leaves and chicha, fermented corn beer, left to freeze high in the mountains where they would die of hypothermia. Others were strangled, suffocated, or hit over the head with a blunt object to ensure a swift death. The cold, dry climate preserved their bodies perfectly. When archaeologists uncovered them centuries later, some were so intact that they still had blood in their veins. Scans
Yeah.
even revealed something horrifying. Some children woke up moments before dying, meaning they were aware, at least briefly, of what was happening. And it wasn't just children. Wives of dead rulers were often forced to die alongside them, because apparently the afterlife required companions.
That happened
In
a
some
lot.
cases,
In a lot of
entire groups of
civilizations.
servants, concubines, and even officials were strangled or buried alive to accompany their leaders into the next world. If you were an elite in Inca society, you weren't just living for yourself, you were living for the emperor. And when he died, you died too. Then there was ritual cannibalism. While the Incas weren't known for large-scale human consumption like some civilizations, there is evidence that certain tribes under Inca rule practiced eating human flesh. This wasn't for survival, it was a spiritual act. Consuming part of a sacrificed warrior or priest was believed to transfer their power to the living. But sacrifices weren't just about killing,
like the
they were
Aztecs.
about control. The Incas ruled over a massive empire, stretching from modern-day Ecuador to Chile, and not everyone was thrilled to be under their control. Some subject tribes were forced to offer up their own people for sacrifice, a constant reminder of who was really in charge. If a tribe resisted, they didn't just lose a few warriors in battle, they lost their children to the priests. It was psychological warfare with a spiritual twist. Despite their brutal practices, the Incas weren't bloodthirsty for no reason. Their entire empire was built on reciprocity with the gods. They believed every sacrifice, human or animal, kept nature in balance. And honestly, their empire thrived for centuries under this system. Roads, agriculture, architecture, all flourished. But when the Spanish arrived in 1532, that balance shattered. The Incas faced not just an enemy, but an unstoppable force of disease, war, and betrayal. Their civilization, once built on divine order, collapsed within a few decades. Inca sacrifice was never seen as barbaric within their own society. It was an honor, a duty, a sacred exchange. But for those chosen, it was a slow walk toward death with no way out. Their world ran on blood and devotion until both ran out.
Well, that was a pretty good video. Again, I learned some things that I didn't know. I did not know. I knew the Egyptians were strange, but I didn't know they were that strange to that extent. Like, you know, digging in somebody's nose to take out their brain, that's some freaky shit. But you know, the Egyptians were obsessed with the dead. I learned about the Incas. I already know a little about the Incas, but it was good to learn some more. I knew they had a very massive empire. Pretty sure it was the largest, you know, indigenous American empire. I also knew that they had really good irrigation systems, really good road systems, and I'm pretty sure they had really good hygiene as well. But yeah, it's just cool learning about civilizations you really didn't know about, terrifying or not. It's just really cool. That's why history is just so amazing. But thank you for watching this video, and if you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe.